My nephew stole $150,000 from me, so I outsmarted him in court and made him watch his life crumble. My nephew Marcus thought stealing $150,000 from his 72-year-old aunt would be easy money. He was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. Let me start with the moment I realized my own family had betrayed me and how that betrayal accidentally turned me into the most dangerous enemy a financial predator could ever face. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now, let's get into my story. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I opened my quarterly investment statement and nearly choked on my coffee. Where my retirement account should have shown $387,000, money I'd saved through 45 years of nursing double shifts, I saw $237,000. $150,000 had simply vanished. My first thought was bank error. My second was fraud. But as I traced through the withdrawal authorizations with my reading glasses, I saw a signature I recognized all too well. My nephew Marcus's elaborate scrawl, the same one I'd helped him practice for his high school graduation cards. Marcus, my late sister's boy, had been managing my finances for 2 years. Aunt Dot, he'd said with that charming smile, you shouldn't worry about complicated investment stuff. I've got my MBA now. Let me handle it for you. Like a fool, I'd trusted him. After all, he was family. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the woman who'd spent 45 years advocating for patients against hospitals, insurance companies, and doctors who thought they could intimidate her because she was black, female, and had started as a nurse's aide. He'd forgotten that I didn't just survive in that world. I thrived in it. As I sat in my tidy living room, surrounded by photos of family members who'd actually earned their place on my mantle, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, that would come later. Not sadness. That was a luxury I couldn't afford. What I felt was the familiar surge of strategic thinking that had served me well in every crisis room I'd ever worked. You see, Marcus thought he was dealing with a confused old lady who'd be too embarrassed to make a fuss. What he'd actually done was declare war on someone who'd been fighting and winning battles longer than he'd been alive. My name is Dorothy Williams, and this is the story of how my nephew's greed accidentally created his own worst nightmare. He wanted to steal my retirement security. Instead, he gave me a new career that would destroy him completely. I reached for my phone and started making calls. The first was to my bank, the second to my lawyer, and the third to my best friend Geneva, who'd been waiting 40 years for me to finally let someone have it properly. Girl, she said when I told her what happened, it's about time you reminded someone why they used to call you the Iron Lady of Ward 7. Indeed, it was. Marcus Williams had just awakened a sleeping giant, and I was about to show him exactly what 4.5 decades of fighting the system had taught me about winning. The war had officially begun, and Marcus had no idea he'd already lost. The next morning, I drove my pristine 2018 Honda Accord to Marcus's downtown office, where he worked as a financial consultant, a title that had always seemed too grand for someone who'd needed 3 tries to pass his licensing exam. I dressed carefully, my navy blue suit that I'd worn to hospital board meetings, my pearl earrings, and my grandmother's ring. When you're about to go to war, you dress like the general you are. Marcus's office was all glass and chrome, designed to impress clients with more money than sense. The receptionist, a young woman with elaborately painted nails, looked me up and down with barely concealed dismissal. Do you have an appointment? I'm his aunt, I said simply. Tell him Dorothy Williams is here to discuss our family finances. 5 minutes later, Marcus appeared, all smiles and expensive cologne. At 34, he was handsome in that smooth way that had always gotten him out of trouble as a child. Today, though, I saw something different in his dark eyes, a flicker of panic that confirmed what I already knew. Aunt Dot, what a nice surprise. Come on back to my office. His office was even more pretentious than the waiting area, with a view of the lake and enough leather furniture to outfit a small ranch. He gestured to a chair across from his massive desk, clearly trying to establish dominance through positioning. I remained standing. Marcus, I said, my voice carrying the same steady tone I'd used when telling families their loved ones weren't going to make it. We need to talk about my missing money. His smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself. Missing money? Aunt Dot, you know the market's been volatile. Sometimes accounts fluctuate. $150,000 doesn't fluctuate, Marcus. It gets stolen. Now the smile disappeared entirely. He moved behind his desk, suddenly looking younger than his years. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you should check with the bank. I did check with the bank. Funny thing, they have records of withdrawals authorized by someone with power of attorney, someone whose signature matches yours perfectly. I pulled out the photocopies I'd made and placed them on his desk. Care to explain? Marcus glanced at the papers, and I watched years of hospital work pay off as I read his body language. Shallow breathing, slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the door. Guilty as charged. Look, Aunt Dot, it's complicated. I was making some investments on your behalf, high-yield opportunities that your conservative portfolio couldn't access. I was going to replace it all before you noticed. With what money, Marcus? Your salary barely covers that Porsche in the parking lot. He straightened, and for a moment, I saw the arrogance that had led him to think he could steal from me in the first place. Listen, I understand you're upset, but you need to trust me. I'm the one with the financial education here. Sometimes these things require. Stop talking. My voice carried the authority that had once silenced entire medical teams during emergencies. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return every penny you stole from me within 30 days, or I'm going to destroy you. Marcus actually laughed, a short, nervous sound. Aunt Dot, I think you're being a little dramatic. You can't just... I've already filed a complaint with the SEC and the State Attorney General's office. I've documented every unauthorized transaction, and I've retained Catherine Morrison as my attorney. You might remember her. She's the one who took down that investment firm last year for elder fraud, got them 20 years in federal prison. The color drained from Marcus's face. Catherine Morrison was indeed legendary in Chicago legal circles, known for her ruthless prosecution of financial crimes against seniors. You wouldn't, he whispered. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on his expensive desk. Marcus, honey, I spent 45 years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I've taken on hospital administrators, insurance executives, and government bureaucrats. You're a small-time thief who got greedy. This isn't even going to be challenging. I straightened and smoothed my skirt. 30 days, Marcus, every penny plus interest. Or you can explain to a federal judge why you thought stealing from your elderly aunt was a sound business strategy. As I walked toward his door, he called after me, his voice cracking slightly. Aunt Dot, please, we're family. I paused without turning around. Family doesn't steal from family, Marcus. What you are is a criminal who happens to share my DNA. There's a difference. I left him sitting in his glass tower, probably wondering how his sweet old aunt had just transformed into his worst nightmare. He was about to find out that underestimating Dorothy Williams was the last mistake many people ever made professionally. The war had officially begun. That evening, I sat at my dining room table, the same oak table where I'd studied for my nursing boards 50 years ago, and spread out everything I had: bank statements, power of attorney documents, copies of Marcus's fraudulent signatures, and my meticulous financial records dating back 15 years. Organization had always been my superpower, and now it was going to be Marcus's downfall. Geneva arrived at 7 sharp with Chinese takeout and her reading glasses. At 75, she was still sharp as a tack. With silver hair and the posture of the high school principal she'd been for 30 years. "All right, girl," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Let's see what this fool did." For the next 3 hours, we went through every document. Geneva had always been good with numbers. You don't manage school budgets for 3 decades without developing an eye for financial irregularities. What we found was even worse than I'd initially thought. "Dorothy," Geneva said, adjusting her glasses and pointing to a series of withdrawals, "look at this pattern. He's been skimming small amounts for over a year before he got bold with the big withdrawals. This wasn't desperation. This was systematic theft." She was right. Starting 18 months ago, there were $2,000 here, $3,500 there, always amounts small enough to potentially go unnoticed by someone who wasn't paying close attention. But I'd been paying attention. I'd just trusted family enough to give him the benefit of the doubt. He tested me, I realized, started small to see if I'd notice, and when I didn't question him, he got greedier. My phone rang at 9:30. The caller ID showed Marcus's number. "Aunt Dot," he began, his voice shaky, "I've been thinking about our conversation today. Maybe we can work something out." "The only thing we're working out is how fast you can return my money," I interrupted. "I don't have it all right now, but I can make payments." "Marcus, let me explain something to you. I don't want your payments. I want my money back, and I want you to face the consequences of what you've done. You stole from an elderly woman who trusted you. That's not just theft. It's elder abuse, and it's a federal crime." "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with panic. "I've got obligations: the car payment, my mortgage, my credit cards. You should have thought about that before you decided to fund your lifestyle with my retirement money. Listen, if you press charges, it'll ruin me. My career, my reputation." "Good," I said calmly. "That's exactly what I want to happen." After I hung up, Geneva looked at me with admiration. "Damn, Dorothy, remind me never to get on your bad side." The next morning, I had my first meeting with Catherine Morrison. Her law office occupied the top floor of a building overlooking Grant Park, and everything about it suggested competence and success. Catherine herself was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady gaze that had probably intimidated countless opposing attorneys. "Mrs. Williams," she said after reviewing my documents, "you've done exceptional work documenting this theft. Most people don't keep records this detailed." "Most people haven't spent 45 years dealing with insurance companies and hospital administrators," I replied. "I learned early that if you don't document everything, they'll claim it never happened." Catherine smiled. "That's exactly the attitude that's going to win this case. Your nephew made several critical errors. First, he left a clear paper trail. Second, he used his power of attorney fraudulently. That's a felony. Third, he targeted an elderly person, which triggers enhanced penalties under federal law." She leaned forward. "But I want to be clear about something. If we pursue this criminally, it's not just about getting your money back. It's about sending him to prison. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about all the patients I'd advocated for over the years, all the times I'd fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. "Catherine, if I don't stop him now, he'll do this to someone else. Maybe someone who doesn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. Yes, I'm prepared for that." "Good." she said, making notes, because I think we can get him on multiple charges: elder abuse, theft, fraudulent use of power of attorney, and possibly racketeering if we can prove this was part of a pattern with other clients. As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the thrill of a fight worth fighting. Marcus thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman. Instead, he'd awakened a force of nature with 45 years of battle experience and nothing left to lose. The hunter was about to become the hunted. 3 days after my meeting with Catherine, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Janet Kozlowski, a private investigator Catherine had recommended. Janet was a former Chicago PD detective who specialized in financial crimes, and her voice carried the no-nonsense tone I recognized from my own profession. Mrs. Williams, I've started looking into your nephew's activities, and I think you're going to want to see what I've found. We met at a coffee shop near my house, neutral territory where Janet could spread out her files without worrying about prying eyes. She was a compact woman in her 50s with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Your nephew has been busy," she said, opening a folder. "He's got 7 elderly clients besides you, all of whom gave him power of attorney for financial management. I've been making discreet inquiries, and at least 3 others show signs of unauthorized withdrawals." My blood chilled. 3 others? Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, age 78, missing approximately $80,000. Mr. James Chin, age 74, missing $45,000. And Mrs. Ruth Goldstein, age 81. She's lost over $200,000. I stared at the photographs Janet had pulled, driver's license photos of 3 people who looked like any of my former patients, trusting faces, the kind of people who still believed in the goodness of family and community. "Are they pressing charges?" Janet's expression darkened. "That's the problem. Patterson is afraid her family will blame her for being foolish. Chen doesn't think anyone will believe him because English isn't his first language. And Goldstein? Her family has convinced her she's developing dementia and can't trust her own memory." The familiar rage that had sustained me through decades of medical advocacy began building in my chest. "He's not just a thief," I said quietly. "He's a predator." "Exactly. And you, Mrs. Williams, might be his only victim with the resources and determination to stop him." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Goldstein, being told by her own family that she couldn't trust her memory while Marcus systematically robbed her blind. I thought about Mr. Chen, probably afraid that reporting the crime would somehow jeopardize his citizenship status, and Mrs. Patterson, carrying the shame of being victimized as if it were somehow her fault. I'd seen this pattern before in the hospital: vulnerable people being taken advantage of by those who were supposed to protect them. The difference was, in the hospital, I'd had institutional backing. Here, I was on my own. But being on my own had never stopped me before. The next morning, I called Catherine with a new proposal. "I want to expand the case. Janet found 3 other victims. I want to go after Marcus for all of it." "Dorothy, that significantly complicates things. Getting other victims to cooperate, coordinating multiple cases." "Then we don't wait for them to cooperate," I interrupted. "We build such a strong case with my situation that when we take it to trial, it encourages the others to come forward. Sometimes people need to see someone else fight before they find their own courage." There was a pause. "You know, in 30 years of practicing law, I've rarely met someone with your combination of strategic thinking and moral clarity. All right, let's make this about more than just your money. Let's make it about justice." Over the next week, Janet continued her investigation, while I did something I'd never done before. I reached out to Marcus's other victims, not to pressure them, but to let them know they weren't alone. My first call was to Mrs. Patterson. Her voice was shaky when she answered, and I could hear the fear even through the phone. Mrs. Patterson, my name is Dorothy Williams. I believe we have something in common. We both trusted Marcus Williams with our finances. I I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Patterson, I'm 72 years old, and I was a nurse for 45 years. I've seen enough people in crisis to recognize when someone is being told they should be ashamed of being victimized. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Marcus is the one who should be ashamed. There was a long silence, then a sob. He took so much money. My children think I'm losing my mind. You're not losing your mind. You're a victim of a crime, and there's a difference. Would you be willing to talk to my attorney? You don't have to commit to anything, but you should know what your options are. By the end of that conversation, Eleanor Patterson had agreed to meet with Catherine. By the end of the week, so had James Chen. Ruth Goldstein was still too frightened, but even she had agreed to document what she remembered. Marcus had made another crucial mistake. He'd assumed his victims would be too embarrassed, too confused, or too isolated to fight back. But he'd forgotten something important about people of our generation. We'd survived the Depression, segregation, wars, and decades of being underestimated. When we finally decided to fight, we didn't give up easily. And now, instead of facing one determined elderly woman, Marcus was about to face four of us, backed by the best financial crimes attorney in Chicago and a private investigator who'd built her career taking down people exactly like him. The net was closing, and Marcus didn't even know it yet. The meeting took place in Catherine's conference room on a rainy Thursday morning. Eleanor Patterson arrived first, a small woman with carefully permed white hair and hands that shook slightly as she clutched her purse. James Chen came next, dignified in his pressed shirt and tie, carrying a manila folder with what I assumed were his financial records. I was the last to arrive, having stopped to pick up coffee and pastries. Old nursing habits die hard, and people think better when they're fed. Catherine started by explaining the legal framework. What we're dealing with here isn't just individual theft, she said, her voice carrying the authority that had made her legendary in Chicago legal circles. This is a pattern of elder financial abuse, which carries severe federal penalties. More importantly, by working together, we make each individual case stronger. Eleanor spoke first, her voice gaining strength as she talked. I gave Marcus power of attorney after my husband died. He seemed so knowledgeable, so professional. When I started noticing the missing money, he told me I was confused about my finances, that grief was affecting my memory. James nodded. He did the same to me, said my English wasn't good enough to understand complex financial statements, made me feel small. I felt the familiar fire in my chest. That's his method, I said. He targets people he thinks won't fight back, then gaslights them when they start asking questions. He picked the wrong group this time. Catherine spread out a timeline she'd constructed. Based on Janet's investigation, Marcus has been operating this scheme for at least 3 years. Dorothy, you were actually one of his later victims, which suggests he was getting greedier and more careless. Or more confident, I added. Success breeds arrogance. Over the next 2 hours, we built our strategy. James had been keeping his own financial records in 3 languages, which provided crucial backup documentation. Eleanor had actually recorded one of her conversations with Marcus, where he'd tried to convince her that her missing money was due to market fluctuations, and I had my nursing experience, which meant I understood medical records, documentation, and most importantly, how to present complex information in ways that judges and juries could understand. There's something else, Janet said, arriving halfway through our meeting with a thick folder. I've been digging into Marcus's lifestyle, and the numbers don't add up. His official income can't support his expenses. The Porsche, the downtown condo, the expensive suits. He's living well beyond his legitimate means. She spread out photographs and financial records. I think he's been using stolen money not just for investments, but to fund a lifestyle designed to attract more wealthy clients. The car, the office, the clothes, it's all part of an image meant to inspire confidence. Catherine studied the documents. This is good. It shows premeditation and sophistication. He wasn't just stealing money, he was using stolen money to steal more money. As the meeting wound down, Eleanor reached across the table and took my hand. Dorothy, I want to thank you. For the first time in months, I don't feel crazy. You were never crazy, I told her. You were being manipulated by an expert. There's a difference. James nodded firmly. My wife was afraid to let me come today. She thought it would be too much trouble, that we should just accept the loss. But I told her, in America, we have laws, laws that protect people like us. After the others left, Catherine and I stayed behind to plan our next moves. I want to be clear about something, she said. This case is about to get very messy. Marcus will fight back, probably with his own lawyers. He'll try to discredit all of you, claim you're confused or vindictive. Are you prepared for that? I thought about all the times hospital administrators had tried to intimidate me, all the insurance executives who'd assumed a black nurse wouldn't have the knowledge or persistence to challenge their denials of care. Catherine, I've been fighting people who underestimated me my entire career. The only difference is, this time it's personal. That evening, Geneva came over for dinner and to hear about the meeting. As I described our growing coalition, she shook her head in amazement. You know what you've done, don't you? She said. You've turned Marcus's greatest advantage into his greatest weakness. How so? He chose victims he thought would be isolated and ashamed. Instead, you've connected them, given them support, and turned them into witnesses for each other. That boy thought he was picking off sheep. Instead, he's awakened a pack of wolves. She was right. Marcus had spent 3 years carefully selecting vulnerable targets, people he assumed would suffer in silence. But he'd forgotten something crucial about people of our generation. We'd spent our entire lives taking care of others. When someone threatens our community, we don't just protect ourselves, we protect each other. And now, instead of 4 isolated victims, Marcus was facing a coordinated group with resources, documentation, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. His nightmare was just beginning. The first shot came exactly 1 week after our group meeting, delivered via certified mail to my front door. Marcus had hired his own attorney, Gerald Hoffman, whose letterhead boasted of his expertise in elder care law and family financial disputes. The letter was 3 pages of legal intimidation designed to scare me into backing down. The gist was predictable. Marcus was deeply concerned about my apparent confusion regarding my finances. He'd been acting in my best interests, making sophisticated investments that I couldn't be expected to understand. The letter suggested I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline and that my accusations were the unfortunate result of paranoid delusions common in elderly individuals. I read it twice, then called Catherine. Standard playbook, she said after I read her the letter. They're going to claim you're incompetent and that Marcus was protecting you from your own poor judgment. How do you feel about that? I laughed, actually laughed out loud. Catherine, I passed my nursing board recertification exam just 2 years ago. I balance my checkbook to the penny every month. I've been managing my own investments since 1995. If Marcus wants to claim I'm incompetent, he's welcome to try. Good, because I think we should call his bluff. I'm scheduling you for a comprehensive cognitive evaluation with Dr. Patricia Michaels. She's a neuropsychologist who specializes in exactly these kinds of competency disputes. 3 days later, I spent 4 hours at Dr. Michael's office, taking every cognitive test imaginable: memory tests, problem solving assessments, mathematical reasoning, language comprehension, everything designed to evaluate mental acuity. Dr. Michaels was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and a professional manner that reminded me of the best doctors I'd worked with. "Mrs. Williams," she said after reviewing my results, "I've been doing these evaluations for 25 years, and your cognitive function is in the top 5% for your age group. In fact, your memory and analytical reasoning scores would be impressive for someone half your age." That same week, Janet delivered another bombshell. She'd been investigating Marcus's financial records and had discovered something that changed everything. "He's not just stealing from elderly clients," she announced during our next meeting. "He's been running a Ponzi scheme, using money from new victims to make partial payments to earlier victims who start asking questions." Catherine leaned forward. "Can you prove that?" "I've traced 3 instances where Marcus used money stolen from one client to make investment returns payments to another. It's classic Ponzi structure: rob Peter to pay Paul, keeping everyone just satisfied enough to not ask too many questions. This elevated the case from simple theft to securities fraud, a federal crime with much more serious penalties, but it also meant we were racing against time. Ponzi schemes eventually collapse when you run out of new victims or when too many existing victims demand their money back. Which means, I realized, that even if Marcus wanted to return my money, he probably can't. He's already spent it trying to keep his scheme afloat. The psychological evaluation results came back just as Gerald Hoffman was ramping up his intimidation campaign. He'd sent letters to Eleanor and James as well, using the same tactics, claiming they were confused, that their families should seek guardianship, that pressing charges would only embarrass them publicly. But when Catherine presented Dr. Michael's evaluation to the court as part of our preliminary filings, Hoffman's strategy crumbled. Not only was I demonstrably competent, but Dr. Michaels had gone a step further, documenting that my memory for financial details was exceptionally precise and that my understanding of investment principles was sophisticated and accurate. "Your nephew's attorney has gone quiet," Catherine informed me after serving him with our expanded complaint. "I think the competency angle isn't working out the way he hoped." That evening, Marcus called me directly, a violation of his attorney's advice, I'm sure. "Aunt Dot," he began, his voice a mixture of desperation and residual arrogance, "this has gotten way out of hand. I never meant for things to go this far." "What you meant, Marcus, was to steal my money and get away with it. The fact that you got caught doesn't change your intentions." "I can make payments. We can work out a schedule." "I don't want payments, Marcus. I want my money back, and I want you to face the consequences of what you've done. You didn't just steal from me, you stole from people who trusted you, people who couldn't afford to lose what they'd worked their entire lives to save. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I've got obligations." "So did I, Marcus. I had an obligation to myself to enjoy the retirement I earned through 45 years of hard work. You took that away from me. Now I'm going to take away your freedom to hurt anyone else." After I hung up, I realized something had shifted. For months, I'd been angry about being victimized. Now I was energized about fighting back. There's a difference between being a victim and being someone who refuses to remain a victim. Marcus was about to learn that difference the hard way. Janet's investigation had uncovered what we'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove. Marcus's scheme was far more extensive than any of us had realized. She arrived at Catherine's office on a cold February morning with boxes of evidence and a grim expression. "I've identified 12 victims," she announced, spreading photographs across the conference table. 12 elderly people, all with substantial assets, all convinced to sign over power of attorney for professional financial management. The faces looking back at us could have been any of my former patients, dignified people in their 70s and 80s, the kind of folks who'd worked hard, saved carefully, and trusted that family or trusted professionals would protect their interests. "The total theft is approaching $1.2 million," Janet continued. "But here's the really disturbing part. Marcus has been targeting people systematically. He volunteers at senior centers, attends estate planning seminars, even goes to church socials. He's been hunting victims." Catherine studied the timeline Janet had constructed. "This isn't opportunistic theft. This is a sophisticated criminal enterprise." I thought about Marcus as a child, always charming, always able to talk his way out of trouble. My sister had worried about his ability to manipulate people, but we'd assumed he'd grow out of it. Instead, he'd turned it into a career. "What about the others?" I asked. "Are any of them willing to come forward?" Janet's expression softened. "That's the hard part. 3 have died since their money was stolen. The stress may have contributed to their decline. 4 have been convinced by their families that they're confused and shouldn't make waves. 2 moved away to live with relatives. That leaves you, Eleanor, and James as the only ones currently able and willing to fight." The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders. We weren't just fighting for our own money. We were fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and for future victims who didn't even know they were at risk. "Then we make our case so strong it speaks for all of them," I said. Over the next week, Catherine filed an expanded federal complaint that painted the full picture of Marcus's operation. The document was devastating in its precision, outlining not just individual thefts, but the systematic nature of his targeting, the sophisticated methods he used to identify and manipulate victims, and the psychological techniques he employed to silence them when they began asking questions. The response was swift and brutal. Gerald Hoffman fired back with emotion, claiming that the expanded charges were vindictive, that we were engaged in a coordinated harassment campaign against a young professional who'd been trying to help elderly clients who lacked the sophistication to manage complex financial portfolios. But Hoffman had made a critical error. In his eagerness to discredit us, he'd filed documents that contained factual claims about Marcus's investment strategies and the performance of his clients' portfolios, claims that Janet was able to prove were false. "Look at this," Janet said, spreading out Hoffman's filing alongside bank records. "He claims Marcus generated positive returns for Mrs. Patterson through aggressive growth strategies. But the money wasn't invested. It was transferred directly to Marcus's personal account and used to make the down payment on his condo." Catherine smiled grimly. "He's not just lying to us. He's lying to the court. That's going to cost him." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Walsh, the elderly woman whose photo Janet had included in the victim files, called Catherine's office directly. "I saw the story in the Tribune," she said, referring to a small article about the federal charges against Marcus. "I want to help." Margaret was 83 years old and sharp as a tack. More importantly, she'd done something none of the other victims had thought to do. She'd recorded her conversations with Marcus. "I've been recording all my important phone calls since my husband died," she explained when we met at Catherine's office. "He always handled the finances, and I was afraid I'd forget important details. When that young man started pressuring me to sign papers, something felt wrong." The recordings were devastating. Hours of Marcus using every manipulation tactic in the book. claiming Margaret was too old to understand modern investments, suggesting her children would think less of her if she made mistakes with money, even threatening to withdraw his services and leave her vulnerable to financial predators. But the most damaging recording came from after Margaret had started asking questions about missing money. Marcus's voice was cold, calculating, nothing like the charming nephew I'd known. "Mrs. Walsh, I think you're getting confused about your finances. That happens sometimes as people get older. Maybe you should talk to your doctor about these memory problems. And perhaps it would be better if you didn't worry your family with these concerns. They have enough to deal with without thinking you're losing your mental faculties." Listening to that recording, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days as a nurse, when I'd seen my first case of child abuse, the cold fury that comes from watching someone deliberately harm a vulnerable person. Catherine looked at me across the conference table. "With Margaret's recordings and Janet's financial investigation, we can prove systematic elder abuse, psychological manipulation, and fraud. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about predatory behavior targeting a vulnerable population." That night, I called my nephew one final time. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "I want you to know that I know everything, not just about my money, but about all of it. Margaret Walsh, the Goldsteins, the Pattersons, all of it." There was a long silence before he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Aunt Dot, please, I can explain." "No, Marcus, the time for explanations is over. You're going to prison, and everyone is going to know exactly what kind of man you really are. The only question now is whether you want to make this easy or hard on yourself." "You're destroying my life." "No, Marcus, you destroyed your own life the moment you decided to steal from people who trusted you. I'm just making sure everyone knows about it." After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but sadness. Not for Marcus, but for the family that had raised him, for the trust that had been broken, and for all the victims who would never get justice. But mostly, I felt determined. Because tomorrow, Catherine would file our final motion, and Marcus Williams would learn that stealing from Dorothy Williams was the worst mistake he'd ever made. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago is an imposing building, all stone and glass designed to remind visitors that justice is serious business. I'd been there twice before, once for jury duty 30 years ago, and once to testify in a medical malpractice case. Today felt different. Today I was the plaintiff, and the defendant was family. Catherine had prepared us meticulously for the preliminary hearing. "This isn't the trial," she'd explained. "This is where we convince the judge that there's enough evidence to proceed, and where we ask for emergency relief to freeze Marcus's assets before he can hide them." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but the weight of the proceedings filled every corner. Judge Patricia Hendricks was a woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd heard every excuse and seen every trick. She reviewed our motion while we waited in silence. Gerald Hoffman sat at the defense table with Marcus, both of them looking considerably less confident than they had a month ago. Marcus kept glancing back at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and panic. I don't think it had truly occurred to him until that moment that his elderly aunt was actually going to follow through on her threats. "Ms. Morrison," Judge Hendricks said, "please present your preliminary evidence." Catherine stood and walked to the podium with the kind of confidence that comes from having an airtight case. "Your Honor, we have documented a systematic pattern of elder financial abuse targeting at least 12 victims over a 3-year period, with total theft exceeding $1.2 million. She began with the paper trail, bank records, forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals. Then she moved to the recordings Margaret had provided, playing excerpts that filled the courtroom with Marcus's voice as he manipulated and threatened an 83-year-old woman. But the most powerful moment came when Catherine called me to testify about my background and qualifications. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "Mr. Hoffman's client has claimed that you lack the mental capacity to understand your own finances. Could you please tell the court about your professional background?" I stood and faced the judge directly. "Your Honor, I worked as a registered nurse for 45 years, with my last 10 years as a charge nurse in the cardiac intensive care unit at Chicago General. I hold current certifications in advanced cardiac life support and critical care nursing. I passed my nursing recertification examination just 2 years ago with a score of 94%. I paused, letting that sink in. I have been managing my own investment portfolio since 1995, with an average annual return of 8.2%. I balance my checkbook monthly, file my own taxes, and maintain detailed financial records. The neuropsychological evaluation ordered by this court confirms that my cognitive function is in the top 5% for my age group. Judge Hendricks looked at Marcus's attorney. "Mr. Hoffman, do you wish to challenge Mrs. Williams's competency?" Gerald Hoffman looked like a man who just realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight. "No, Your Honor." "Good, because frankly, the competency argument was insulting from the start." The judge's voice carried a sharp edge. "Mrs. Williams clearly has the mental acuity to manage her own affairs and to recognize when someone is stealing from her." Catherine then presented Janet's investigation, showing the pattern of targeting, the sophisticated methods Marcus used to identify victims, and most damaging of all, the evidence that he'd been running a Ponzi scheme, using money from newer victims to placate earlier ones. When it was Hoffman's turn, he seemed to realize his case was hopeless. Instead of the aggressive defense he'd promised in his letters, he made a brief, half-hearted argument that Marcus had been making good faith investment decisions that had simply not performed as expected. Judge Hendricks wasn't buying it. "Mr. Hoffman, your client systematically targeted elderly individuals, manipulated them into signing over financial control, then stole their money to fund his own lifestyle. This isn't about investment performance. This is about theft, fraud, and elder abuse." She granted our motion in its entirety. Marcus's assets were frozen immediately. His professional licenses were suspended pending investigation, and the case was fast-tracked for trial. But the real victory came when Judge Hendricks addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Williams, I want you to understand something. Elder financial abuse is not just theft. It's a betrayal of the fundamental trust that holds our society together. Elderly people work their entire lives to build security for their retirement years. When someone exploits that trust, they're not just stealing money, they're stealing peace of mind, dignity, and the right to age with security." She paused, letting her words settle. "You specifically targeted people you thought were vulnerable, people you assumed wouldn't fight back. That shows not just greed, but a particular kind of cruelty that this court takes very seriously." As we left the courthouse, Catherine was practically glowing. "That was one of the most decisive preliminary rulings I've ever seen. Judge Hendricks clearly understands what we're dealing with here." But for me, the victory felt different than I'd expected. Not triumphant exactly, but more like the satisfaction I used to feel when a patient turned a corner after a long illness. The crisis wasn't over, but we'd reached the point where recovery was not just possible, but likely. That evening, Geneva came over to celebrate with a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion. "You know what you did today?" she said, raising her glass. "You reminded that courtroom that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. Every time some young person sees an old woman and assumes she's an easy target, They should remember Dorothy Williams and think twice. She was right. This case had become about more than just my money or even Marcus's crimes. It had become about respect, dignity, and the fundamental principle that age brings wisdom and strength, not weakness. Marcus had made the mistake of his life when he'd assumed otherwise. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the preliminary hearing. Catherine's voice was tight with controlled anger. Dorothy, they're trying to flip the script. Hoffman has filed a motion claiming that you and the other victims are part of a conspiracy to frame Marcus, and that you're being manipulated by Janet and me for financial gain. I sat up in bed, fully awake. What kind of conspiracy? He's claiming that I'm running a fee-splitting scheme with Janet, that we targeted Marcus because he's successful, and that we've coached elderly clients to make false accusations. It's desperate, but it's also potentially dangerous if the judge takes it seriously. By 9 that morning, I was in Catherine's office, reading through Hoffman's motion. It was 12 pages of legal jargon, but the basic accusation was clear. We were the real criminals, preying on Marcus's success and exploiting elderly people's confusion for our own profit. It's actually clever, Catherine admitted reluctantly. He's taken every piece of evidence we've presented and reframed it. Your detailed financial records, obviously coached. Margaret's recordings, clearly doctored. Janet's investigation, a fabrication designed to create a case where none existed. I felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that had sustained me through decades of fighting for my patients. So what do? We prove him wrong, thoroughly, definitively, and publicly. The first step was challenging Hoffman's factual claims. Catherine immediately filed for an independent technical analysis of Margaret's recordings, subpoenaed my medical records to prove my cognitive competency, and demanded a full audit of Janet's investigation methods. But I had a different idea. Catherine, what if we go on offense instead of defense? What do you mean? Hoffman is claiming we're running a conspiracy. What if we prove that Marcus is the one running a conspiracy, not just against his victims, but against the court system itself? Catherine leaned forward. Explain. Janet found evidence that Marcus has been using stolen money to pay for his defense. If we can prove that Hoffman's fees are being paid with money stolen from elderly victims, then Hoffman becomes an unwitting accomplice to the very crimes he's defending. The next week was a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. Janet traced the payments to Hoffman's law firm, proving that they came directly from accounts that contained stolen funds. Catherine filed a motion to disqualify Hoffman as counsel, arguing that he was being paid with the proceeds of the crimes he was defending. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Marcus himself. Apparently frustrated with his attorney's strategy and panicking about the asset freeze, Marcus had been making calls to his victims, trying to convince them to drop their complaints. Unfortunately for him, several of those calls were recorded. Eleanor Patterson brought us the first recording. Her voice was shaky as she played it on Catherine's conference room speaker. Marcus's voice filled the room, smooth and persuasive. Eleanor, I know you're confused about all this legal stuff. Your family must be so stressed seeing you go through this. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you just withdrew your complaint. I can make sure you get some of your money back if you help me resolve this quietly. That's witness tampering, Catherine said immediately. A felony. But it got worse. James Chen had received a similar call, but in his recording, Marcus had taken a more threatening approach. Mr. Chen, I think you need to understand that these legal proceedings could get very public. Immigration authorities sometimes take interest in elderly immigrants who make accusations against American citizens. It might be better for your family if you reconsidered your position. That recording made my blood boil. Marcus wasn't just stealing money. He was using people's deepest fears against them. The third recording, from Margaret Walsh, showed Marcus at his most manipulative. Margaret, I've been talking to some people, and they're saying that elderly people who make false accusations can be held liable for legal fees. With my attorney costs running over $50,000, you could lose your house if this doesn't go well for you. Catherine immediately filed additional charges for witness tampering, intimidation, and making terroristic threats. But more importantly, she used the recordings to demonstrate the pattern of psychological manipulation that was central to our case. Your Honor, she argued at the emergency hearing she'd requested, these recordings prove exactly what we've been saying from the beginning. Mr. Williams targets elderly victims precisely because he believes he can intimidate them into silence. These calls show the same manipulative behavior he used to steal their money in the first place. Judge Hendricks listened to all three recordings in their entirety, her expression growing darker with each one. Mr. Hoffman, she said when they finished, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you advise your client to make these calls? Hoffman looked genuinely shocked. Absolutely not, Your Honor. I specifically instructed Mr. Williams to have no contact with any of the alleged victims. Then your client has violated both my orders and your legal advice while potentially committing additional felonies. She turned to Marcus. Mr. Williams, do you understand that you have just created evidence of witness tampering while on bail for federal fraud charges? Marcus seemed to shrink in his chair. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he looked like what he actually was, a criminal caught in the act. I was just trying to help them understand. You were trying to intimidate elderly victims into dropping their complaints against you. Judge Hendricks interrupted. That's witness tampering, and it's going to result in additional charges and the revocation of your bail. As the bailiff led Marcus away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a deep sadness for the path he'd chosen, but also a fierce pride in the strength Eleanor, James, and Margaret had shown by recording those calls and bringing them forward. After the hearing, Catherine and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. You know what Marcus's biggest mistake was? She asked. Stealing from me in the first place? No, she said, smiling. His biggest mistake was assuming that elderly people who'd survived everything our generation has survived would be too frightened to fight back. He confused physical frailty with weakness of character. She was right. Marcus had spent 3 years successfully intimidating victims into silence, but he'd never faced victims who had the resources, the determination, and most importantly, the support system to fight back effectively. Now he was about to learn that underestimating Dorothy Williams and her allies was the last mistake he'd ever make as a free man. The story broke on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest for witness tampering. Nephew steals $150,000 from elderly aunt, targets other seniors, was the Tribune's headline, with a photo of me walking out of the courthouse looking, according to Geneva, like someone you definitely don't want to mess with. The reporter, Sandra Martinez, had done her homework. The article didn't just cover my case, it detailed the entire scope of Marcus's operation, the systematic way he'd targeted elderly victims, and the psychological manipulation he'd used to silence them when they began asking questions. But what made the story really powerful was Sandra's decision to focus on the victims who'd fought back. Eleanor Patterson was quoted extensively, describing how she'd gone from feeling confused and ashamed to angry and determined. James Chin spoke about how the support of other victims had given him courage to stand up for himself, and Margaret Walsh, bless her heart, had provided Sandra with excerpts from her recordings. I want people to know, Margaret was quoted as saying, that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. That young man thought he could scare me into silence, but he picked the wrong group of senior citizens. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Catherine's office was flooded with calls from other potential victims, from reporters wanting interviews, and from attorneys handling similar cases who wanted to share information. My own phone rang constantly. Old colleagues from the hospital, neighbors, even former patients who'd seen the story and wanted to express their support. But the most important call came from Detective Maria Rodriguez with the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "we've been investigating similar cases for months, but we hadn't been able to get victims to cooperate. Your case has opened the floodgates. We have 17 new complaints filed just this week. 17 new victims." The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. Marcus's operation had been even more extensive than we'd realized. "What can we do to help?" I asked. "Would you be willing to speak to some of these new victims? Many of them are scared, ashamed, afraid their families will think they're losing their mental faculties. But seeing what you've accomplished, it's giving them courage." That weekend, I found myself in the community room of St. Mary's Senior Center, facing a group of 12 elderly people who'd been victimized by various financial predators. Catherine and Detective Rodriguez had organized the meeting, but I was the one they'd asked to speak first. Looking out at their faces, dignified people in their 70s and 80s, many of whom reminded me of my former patients, I felt the same protective anger that had driven my entire career. "My name is Dorothy Williams," I began, "and 6 months ago, I discovered that my nephew had stolen $150,000 from me. He thought that because I was elderly, I'd be too embarrassed, too confused, or too frightened to fight back." I paused, looking at each face in turn. "He was wrong, and whoever stole from you was wrong too." For the next hour, I talked about documentation, about legal resources, about the importance of not accepting shame for being victimized. But mostly, I talked about dignity, about the fact that age brings wisdom and strength, not weakness. "You worked your entire lives to build security for your retirement," I told them. "When someone steals that security, they're not just taking money. They're trying to take your dignity, your independence, your right to age with respect. Don't let them." The questions came fast. How do you find a good attorney? What if your family thinks you're confused? How do you prove financial abuse when the paperwork is so complicated? But the most powerful moment came when an 80-year-old man named Frank Kowalski stood up. "I gave my financial advisor power of attorney 2 years ago," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "When I started asking questions about missing money, he told me I was getting senile, that I should be grateful he was protecting me from my own poor judgment. I believed him. I actually believed I was losing my mind." He looked directly at me. "But listening to you today, I remember something. I'm a retired engineer. I designed bridges that are still standing after 40 years. I raised 4 children, put them all through college, and managed my family's finances for 50 years. I'm not senile. I'm a victim of theft." The room erupted in applause, and I saw something I'd hoped to see: the transformation from shame to anger, from confusion to clarity, from isolation to solidarity. After the meeting, Detective Rodriguez pulled me aside. "Mrs. Williams, what you did in there. I've been working financial crimes for 15 years, and I've never seen victims empower each other like that." Catherine nodded. "You've started something, Dorothy. This isn't just about your case anymore. It's become a movement." She was right. Over the next week, the story was picked up by national news outlets. I did interviews with CNN, NBC, and NPR, always focusing on the same message: elderly people are not easy targets, and financial predators who think otherwise are about to learn a very expensive lesson. The best interview was with AARP's magazine. The reporter Helen Chang understood exactly what the story was really about. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "your case represents something larger than individual justice. It's about changing the narrative around aging in America." "Exactly," I replied. "For too long, we've allowed people to equate aging with vulnerability. But the truth is, people my age have survived the Depression, segregation, wars, economic upheavals, and social transformations that would challenge anyone. We're not vulnerable, we're experienced, and experience properly applied is a formidable weapon." The article ran with the headline, "The Iron Lady of Chicago: How One Nurse's Fight Against Financial Abuse Became a National Movement." The photo showed me sitting in my living room, surrounded by the evidence that had brought down Marcus, looking directly at the camera with what the caption called the steady gaze of someone who's won battles most people wouldn't dare fight. That night, Geneva called me laughing. "Girl, you realize what you've done? You've become the poster child for not messing with senior citizens." "Good," I said. "It's about time somebody reminded people that gray hair doesn't mean we're pushovers." Marcus, sitting in federal detention awaiting trial, was probably beginning to understand that lesson, but by then, it was far too late for him to do anything about it. Federal prosecutor Amanda Chen was everything I'd hoped for in an ally: sharp, thorough, and personally offended by crimes against vulnerable populations. She was also about my daughter's age, which gave her a perspective on elder abuse that went beyond professional duty. "Mrs. Williams," she said during our preparation meeting, "I want you to understand something. This case has become a priority for our office. Elder financial abuse is one of the fastest growing crimes in America, and cases like yours, where the victims fight back effectively, send a message that we take these crimes seriously." She spread out the expanded indictment that had been filed after Marcus's additional arrests. The original charges of theft and elder abuse had been joined by witness tampering, running a Ponzi scheme, securities fraud, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, Marcus was looking at 25 to 30 years in federal prison. "The defense is going to try every trick in the book," Amanda warned. "They'll claim you're vindictive, that this is a family dispute blown out of proportion, that Marcus was trying to help you make money and things just went wrong." "Let them try," I said. "I've got 45 years of documentation that proves exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. If they want to claim I'm some confused old lady, they're welcome to embarrass themselves." The trial preparation was exhaustive. Amanda walked me through every piece of evidence, every document, every recording. She helped me understand how federal court procedures differed from the state-level preliminary hearings we'd already attended. Most importantly, she prepared me for cross-examination. "Gerald Hoffman is going to try to rattle you," she explained. "He'll question your memory, your motivations, your relationship with Marcus. He might even suggest that you're doing this for attention or out of spite." "I've been cross-examined by hospital administrators, insurance company lawyers, and state health inspectors," I replied. "I think I can handle one defense attorney." But Amanda was thorough. She had me practice answering hostile questions, staying calm under pressure, and presenting complex financial information in ways that jurors could understand. It reminded me of my early days as a nurse, when experienced colleagues had taught me how to handle difficult doctors, demanding families, and crisis situations. The most important preparation session involved the other victims. Eleanor, James, and Margaret had all agreed to testify, but they were understandably nervous about facing Marcus's attorney in open court. "Remember," I told them during our group preparation session, "we're not just testifying for ourselves. We're testifying for everyone who's been victimized by people like Marcus, and for everyone who might be victimized in the future if we don't stop him." Eleanor nodded firmly. I keep thinking about what you said at that senior center meeting about how they're not just stealing money, they're trying to steal our dignity. I won't let him do that to me or anyone else. Janet's investigation had uncovered even more damaging evidence. Bank records showed that Marcus had been living far beyond his legitimate income for 3 years, funding a lifestyle that included not just the Porsche and downtown condo, but expensive vacations, designer clothes, and a country club membership that cost more than many people's annual salary. The jury needs to see that this wasn't desperation, Amanda explained. This was greed. Marcus wasn't stealing to survive. He was stealing to live like a wealthy man while his victims struggled with the financial insecurity he'd created. The most devastating evidence came from Marcus's own computer, which had been seized during the FBI raid on his office. Digital forensics experts had recovered emails that showed the calculated nature of his operation. In one email to a friend, Marcus had written, "The key is finding elderly clients who are isolated and a little confused about modern finance. They sign the power of attorney papers without really understanding what they're giving up, and by the time they figure out something's wrong, they're too embarrassed to make a fuss." Another email, sent just 2 months before I discovered the theft, was even more chilling. "Aunt Dot is perfect. She's got money, she trusts family, and she's at that age where people expect her to be a little scattered about financial details. I can milk this for at least another year before she catches on." Reading those emails, I felt a cold fury that reminded me of the worst cases of patient abuse I'd encountered in my nursing career. The casual cruelty, the calculated exploitation of trust, the complete lack of empathy for the harm being caused. Those emails are going to destroy any sympathy the jury might have had, Amanda said with satisfaction. They show premeditation. They show the systematic nature of his targeting, and they show his complete contempt for his victims. The final piece of preparation involved media strategy. The case had attracted significant attention, and both sides knew that public opinion could influence the jury pool. "We want this coverage," Amanda explained. "Every story about this case sends a message to other potential predators that elderly victims aren't helpless, and to other elderly people that they don't have to suffer in silence." I did 3 more interviews in the weeks leading up to trial, always focusing on the same themes: dignity, strength, and the importance of fighting back against people who prey on perceived vulnerability. The best interview was with a local television station that had been covering elder abuse issues. The reporter, Tom Bradley, asked exactly the right question. "Mrs. Williams, what would you say to other elderly people who might be victims of financial abuse but are too scared or ashamed to come forward?" I looked directly into the camera. "I'd say this: you are not alone, you are not helpless, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. The only person who should be ashamed is the criminal who stole from you. Age brings wisdom, experience, and strength, not weakness. Trust that strength, document everything, and fight back. People like Marcus Williams count on our silence. Don't give them that gift." As the trial date approached, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early nursing days: the combination of nervousness and excitement that comes with facing a crucial challenge that you know you're prepared for. Marcus had made the mistake of thinking that stealing from Dorothy Williams would be easy. He was about to learn in the most public way possible just how wrong he'd been. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of March 15th. I'd never seen so many reporters at a criminal trial, but then again, the case had captured national attention as a symbol of elderly empowerment and the fight against financial predators. I wore my best navy suit, the same one I'd worn to confront Marcus in his office nearly a year ago. Geneva sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, along with Eleanor, James, and Margaret. Detective Rodriguez was there, along with several other elderly people who'd been victimized by financial scams and had followed my case as a source of inspiration. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the court to order, and I got my first good look at the jury. 12 faces, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, a mix of races and backgrounds that reflected the diversity of Chicago. Several of them looked at me with what seemed like respect, which I hoped was a good sign. Amanda Chen stood to deliver the prosecution's opening argument, and I was impressed by her presence. She was tall, confident, and spoke with the kind of moral authority that comes from truly believing in your case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this case is about trust betrayed, vulnerability exploited, and the systematic theft of retirement security from elderly victims who had every reason to believe they were safe. She walked to the exhibit table and picked up a photograph of Marcus. The defendant, Marcus Williams, spent 3 years operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to steal money from elderly clients who trusted him with their financial security. He didn't steal from strangers. He stole from his own family, from people who attended his church, from vulnerable seniors who believed his promises to protect and grow their life savings. Amanda then moved to a photograph of me. Dorothy Williams is 72 years old. She worked as a registered nurse for 45 years, saving lives and advocating for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. She managed her own investments successfully for decades, maintained detailed financial records, and had every reason to trust her nephew when he offered to help manage her retirement funds. The next hour was a master class in presenting complex financial crimes to a lay jury. Amanda walked through the timeline of Marcus's thefts, the systematic way he'd targeted victims, and the psychological manipulation he'd used to silence them when they began asking questions. But the most powerful moment came when she played excerpts from the recordings of Marcus's calls to his victims after the charges were filed. Marcus's voice filled the courtroom. Eleanor, I know you're confused about all this legal stuff. Your family must be so stressed seeing you go through this. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you just withdrew your complaint. Amanda paused the recording and looked at the jury. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the voice of a man trying to intimidate an 80-year-old woman into dropping her complaint about his theft of her life savings. That is witness tampering, and it shows you exactly who Marcus Williams really is. She concluded by addressing the broader implications of the case. This isn't just about money, though Marcus Williams stole over $1 million from elderly victims. This is about respect, dignity, and the fundamental principle that elderly people deserve to live their final years with security and peace of mind. The defendant tried to steal that security. Your verdict will determine whether he succeeds. Gerald Hoffman's opening argument was everything I'd expected, and everything Amanda had prepared me for. He was smooth, polished, and focused entirely on portraying Marcus as a well-meaning young man who'd gotten in over his head trying to help elderly relatives and clients. Ladies and gentlemen, Hoffman began, Marcus Williams is not the criminal mastermind the prosecution wants you to believe he is. He's a 34-year-old financial advisor who made some poor investment decisions while trying to help elderly family members and clients achieve better returns on their retirement savings. Hoffman painted a picture of Marcus as overwhelmed by responsibility, trying to manage complex financial portfolios for people who didn't understand modern investment strategies. He suggested that the missing money was the result of market volatility and poor timing, not theft. But his biggest argument was one Amanda had warned me about, that this was really a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. Dorothy Williams is Marcus's aunt, Hoffman said, and family disputes about money can get very complicated, very personal, and very ugly. What you're seeing here is an elderly woman who's angry about investment losses and has convinced herself that her nephew is a criminal rather than accepting that her money was lost to bad market conditions. He went on to suggest that I was being manipulated by attorneys and investigators who stood to profit from a large settlement, and that my vindictive pursuit of Marcus was destroying a young man's life over what were essentially business disagreements. Listening to Hoffman's opening, I felt the same controlled anger I'd experienced countless times when insurance company lawyers had tried to deny coverage for my patient's necessary medical care. The combination of condescension, victim blaming, and outright falsehood was infuriating, but I'd learned long ago not to let that anger show. Instead, I sat quietly, taking notes and occasionally making eye contact with jury members who looked at me during Hoffman's presentation. I wanted them to see exactly what Marcus had seen when he'd decided I'd be an easy target, a dignified elderly woman who happened to be a lot stronger and smarter than she appeared. When Hoffman finished, Judge Hendricks called a recess. As we filed out of the courtroom, Amanda squeezed my shoulder. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Like I felt every time a hospital administrator tried to tell me that my patient didn't really need the treatment I was requesting, I replied, ready to prove them wrong. Geneva overheard and laughed. Lord help that defense attorney. He has no idea what he's up against. She was right. Gerald Hoffman had just made the same mistake Marcus had made a year ago. He'd underestimated Dorothy Williams. The difference was, Marcus was already in jail. Hoffman was about to join him in the category of people who'd learned that lesson too late. Amanda Chen's presentation of the prosecution case was methodical, thorough, and devastating. She started with the financial evidence, bank records, forged signatures, unauthorized withdrawals, building a foundation that was impossible to challenge because it was all documented fact. The first witness was Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant with the FBI who had analyzed Marcus's financial records. She was young, professional, and unshakable under cross-examination. Based on my analysis, she testified, Mr. Williams systematically transferred funds from client accounts to his personal accounts over a period of 36 months. The total theft exceeded $1.2 million from 12 different victims. She walked the jury through charts and graphs that showed the pattern clearly. Small transfers at first, then increasingly larger amounts as Marcus grew more confident. The visual evidence was compelling, but her conclusion was even more damaging. In my professional opinion, Sarah said, this was not investment activity. No securities were purchased, no legitimate financial instruments were involved. This was straight theft, disguised by the defendant's position of trust. Hoffman's cross-examination focused on the complexity of modern financial markets, suggesting that Sarah might not understand the sophisticated investment strategies Marcus had been employing. It was a mistake. Sarah had a master's degree in forensic accounting and 15 years of experience with the FBI's white-collar crime unit. Mr. Hoffman, she replied calmly, I've analyzed hundreds of complex investment schemes. This wasn't complex. It was simple theft. Money went from victim accounts directly to the defendant's personal account, where it was used to pay for cars, vacations, and luxury goods. There were no investments. The second day of testimony focused on the victims. Eleanor Patterson testified first, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. He told me I was getting confused, she said, looking directly at Marcus. When I asked about the missing money, he said that sometimes elderly people get mixed up about their finances and that I should trust him to handle things properly. Under cross-examination, Hoffman tried to suggest that Eleanor was indeed confused, that her memory wasn't reliable. It was a tactical error that Amanda had anticipated. Mrs. Patterson, Amanda said on redirect, You mentioned that Mr. Williams said elderly people get confused about finances. Are you confused about your finances? Eleanor straightened in her chair. No, I am not. I balanced my own checkbook for 60 years, managed my household budget through raising 4 children, and put 2 kids through college by carefully managing our family's money. I'm not confused. I was robbed. James Chin's testimony was equally powerful. He described Marcus's psychological manipulation in detail, including the suggestion that immigration authorities might question elderly immigrants who made accusations against American citizens. I came to this country 50 years ago, James said, his voice carrying quiet dignity. I built a successful business, raised my family, and paid my taxes. I am an American citizen, and I have the right to seek justice when someone steals from me. But it was Margaret Walsh's testimony that provided the most devastating blow to the defense. At 83, she was sharp, articulate, and had recorded evidence that couldn't be disputed. Amanda played the recordings in their entirety, and the courtroom was silent as Marcus's voice filled the space, revealing the calculated cruelty of his manipulation. Mrs. Walsh, Amanda asked after the recordings finished, why did you record these conversations? Because something felt wrong from the beginning, Margaret replied. I've lived 83 years, and you learn to trust your instincts. When a young man starts pressuring you to sign papers and tells you not to worry your family with complicated financial matters, that's when you start paying very close attention. On the third day, it was my turn to testify. I'd been dreading and anticipating this moment in equal measure. As I walked to the witness stand, I felt the same combination of nerves and determination I'd experienced before every difficult medical procedure I'd ever assisted with. Amanda's direct examination was thorough but comfortable. She walked me through my professional background, my financial management history, and the discovery of Marcus's theft. I spoke clearly and calmly, making eye contact with the jury whenever possible. Mrs. Williams, Amanda said, the defense has suggested that you might be confused about your finances due to your age. How do you respond to that? I looked directly at Gerald Hoffman before answering. I would say that anyone who thinks 72 years of life experience makes someone confused rather than wise has a lot to learn about aging. I've been managing complex medical cases, hospital budgets, and my own financial portfolio longer than Mr. Hoffman has been alive. Age brings wisdom, not confusion. Can you tell the jury about your relationship with your nephew before you discovered the theft? I loved Marcus like a son, I said, and for the first time, my voice carried the sadness I felt about the loss of family. His mother was my younger sister, and after she died, I tried to be a positive influence in his life. I helped pay for his education, celebrated his achievements, and trusted him completely. That trust was the weapon he used against me. Amanda then had me walk through the financial documents, explaining how I'd discovered the discrepancies and what I'd done to investigate them. The jury listened intently as I described my methodical approach to documenting the theft. Why didn't you just confront Marcus privately and ask for the money back? Amanda asked. Because by the time I discovered the full scope of his theft, I realized this wasn't just about my money. Marcus had been targeting other elderly people, people who might not have the resources or knowledge to fight back. If I didn't stop him, he would continue victimizing vulnerable seniors. Gerald Hoffman's cross-examination was aggressive from the start. He questioned my memory, my motivations, and my relationship with Marcus. But I'd been prepared for this by Amanda's coaching and by 45 years of dealing with hostile questioning from doctors, administrators, and insurance company representatives. Mrs. Williams, Hoffman said, isn't it true that you've always been jealous of Marcus's success? No, Mr. Hoffman, I was proud of Marcus's success. I helped fund his education because I wanted him to succeed. What I'm not proud of is what he chose to do with the opportunities he was given. Isn't it true that you're pursuing this case because you're angry about investment losses and you want someone to blame? Mr. Hoffman, I've been investing successfully for 30 years. I understand that markets go up and down. What Marcus did wasn't investing, it was stealing. There's a difference between market losses and theft, and I'm smart enough to know which is which. Hoffman tried several more angles, suggesting I was being manipulated by my attorneys, that I was seeking attention, that this was really about family rivalry. But each attack only gave me another opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of sharp, articulate thinking that made his confused elderly woman theory look ridiculous. The most important moment came when he tried to suggest that I was vindictive and unforgiving. Mrs. Williams, don't you think that destroying your nephew's life is a rather extreme response to what might have been honest mistakes? I looked at him steadily. Mr. Hoffman, Marcus didn't make honest mistakes. He made calculated decisions to steal from elderly people who trusted him. He targeted us because he thought we'd be too ashamed, too confused, or too frightened to fight back. If stopping him from victimizing other seniors means his life is destroyed, then so be it. I'd rather destroy the life of one predator than allow him to destroy the security of dozens of innocent victims. The courtroom was silent for a moment after I said that. Looking at the jury, I could see that several of them were nodding slightly. They understood that this case was about more than money. It was about protecting vulnerable people from predators who viewed them as easy targets. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt the same satisfaction I'd experienced after successfully advocating for a patient against impossible odds. I'd told the truth clearly and powerfully, and I'd shown the jury exactly who Dorothy Williams really was. Not a confused elderly victim, but a formidable opponent who refused to be silenced. Amanda's closing witnesses included Janet, who testified about the scope of her investigation, and Detective Rodriguez, who placed Marcus's crimes in the context of the broader epidemic of elder financial abuse. Cases like this, Detective Rodriguez testified, are becoming increasingly common. Predators specifically target elderly victims because they assume they'll be too ashamed or confused to report the crimes. Mrs. Williams and the other victims in this case have shown tremendous courage in coming forward. As the prosecution rested its case, I felt confident that we'd proven not just Marcus's guilt, but the systematic predatory nature of his crimes. The defense would now have to explain away a mountain of evidence, recorded confessions, and the testimony of victims who'd clearly demonstrated their competence and credibility. Marcus had bet his freedom on the assumption that elderly victims wouldn't fight back effectively. As he sat at the defense table, probably finally understanding the full scope of the case against him, he was learning that it was the worst bet he'd ever made. Gerald Hoffman's defense case lasted exactly 1.5 days, and watching it unfold was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. His strategy seemed to shift every few hours as each line of defense crumbled under the weight of evidence Amanda had presented. His first witness was Dr. Richard Steinberg, a psychiatrist he'd hired to testify about age-related cognitive decline. Dr. Steinberg had never examined any of us, but Hoffman apparently hoped he could convince the jury that elderly people were inherently unreliable witnesses. It was a spectacular miscalculation. Under Amanda's cross-examination, Dr. Steinberg was forced to admit that he'd never evaluated any of the victims, that he had no specific knowledge of our medical histories, and that cognitive decline wasn't universal among elderly people. Doctor, Amanda said, you're aware that Mrs. Williams passed a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with scores in the top 5% for her age group? I, yes, I was made aware of that. And you're aware that she maintained professional nursing certifications requiring continuing education and testing until her retirement 2 years ago? Yes. So, when you testified that people in their 70s often experience confusion about financial matters, you weren't referring to any of the actual victims in this case, were you? Dr. Steinberg looked uncomfortable. I was speaking generally about age related changes. In other words, you were testifying about theoretical elderly people, not the real elderly people who were victimized by the defendant. Hoffman's second witness was even worse, a financial advisor named Robert Chang, who tried to argue that Marcus's actions could be interpreted as legitimate investment strategies. But Chang hadn't reviewed the actual evidence, and under cross-examination, it became clear he'd been hired simply to provide expert cover for what everyone knew was theft. Mr. Chang, Amanda asked, you've reviewed the defendant's financial records, correct? Yes. And can you point to any evidence that the money taken from victim accounts was actually invested in securities, bonds, or any other legitimate financial instruments? Chang shuffled through his papers. Well, the investment strategies were complex. That's not what I asked. Can you point to any evidence of actual investments? Not specifically, no. Because there weren't any investments, were there? The money went directly from victim accounts to the defendant's personal accounts, where it was used to buy luxury goods and fund his lifestyle. That appears to be what happened, yes. The most damaging moment for the defense came when Hoffman called Marcus's former business partner, David Kim, apparently hoping he would testify about Marcus's good character and professional competence. Instead, under oath, Kim revealed that he'd severed their partnership specifically because he'd suspected Marcus was engaging in unethical practices. I started noticing irregularities in client accounts, Kim testified. When I confronted Marcus about them, he became defensive and evasive. I ultimately decided I couldn't risk my professional reputation by remaining associated with him. Hoffman looked stunned. But, Mr. Kim, you never reported these suspicions to authorities. No, I didn't. I should have, and I regret that now. If I had spoken up, some of these elderly victims might have been spared. On cross-examination, Amanda elicited even more damaging testimony from Kim about Marcus's lifestyle, his apparent income sources, and his attitude toward elderly clients. Did the defendant ever make comments about his elderly clients? Amanda asked. Kim looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. He used to say that elderly clients were easy money because they didn't ask many questions and they trusted younger professionals to handle their finances properly. Did he ever express any concern about his elderly clients' financial well-being? His comments were always about how much money he could make from managing their accounts. But the final nail in the defense's coffin came when Hoffman made the inexplicable decision to put Marcus on the witness stand. I assume he felt he had no choice. The evidence was so overwhelming that Marcus's only hope was to charm the jury and somehow explain away the mountain of evidence against him. It was a disaster from the first question. Marcus tried to present himself as a well-meaning young professional who'd gotten in over his head, but his story kept changing, and he couldn't explain away the recorded phone calls, the forged signatures, or the complete lack of any legitimate investments. Mr. Williams, Amanda said during her cross-examination, you testified that you were making investments on behalf of your elderly clients. Can you name a single stock, bond, or fund that you purchased with Mrs. Williams' money? Marcus paused for a long time. The investments they were complex derivative instruments. I see. What were the names of these derivative instruments? Another long pause. I don't recall the specific names. You don't recall the names of investments worth $150,000? It was, it was a while ago. Amanda then produced bank records showing the direct transfers from my account to Marcus's personal account. Mr. Williams, can you explain how purchasing complex derivative instruments would result in money being transferred directly to your personal checking account? Marcus's face reddened. Those were preliminary transfers. I was consolidating funds before making the actual investments. For 3 years? You were consolidating funds for 3 years without making any investments? The questioning continued for 2 hours, and with each answer, Marcus dug himself deeper. He couldn't explain the luxury purchases, couldn't name any investments, couldn't justify the witness tampering calls, and most damaging of all, couldn't explain why he'd never told any of his victims about these supposed complex investment strategies. By the time Amanda finished with him, Marcus looked exactly like what he was, a caught criminal making up stories to avoid the consequences of his actions. That evening, as we prepared for closing arguments, Amanda was almost giddy with satisfaction. Dorothy, I've been prosecuting white-collar criminals for 15 years, and I've rarely seen a defense collapse so completely. Hoffman actually helped us prove our case by putting Marcus on the stand. What do you think will happen tomorrow? I asked. I think we're going to get convictions on every count, and I think Marcus Williams is going to spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Geneva, who'd attended every day of the trial, shook her head in amazement. That boy really thought he could charm his way out of this, didn't he? Some people never learn that being smooth-talking isn't the same as being smart. She was right. Marcus had spent his entire life using charm and manipulation to avoid consequences. But federal court wasn't a family gathering or a social situation where his personality could overcome evidence. Here, the truth mattered more than charisma, and the truth was about to destroy him. The closing arguments began on a gray Friday morning, and the courthouse was packed with reporters, elderly advocates, and other victims of financial crimes who'd been following the case. I sat in the front row, flanked by Eleanor, James, and Margaret, feeling like we were representing not just ourselves, but every elderly person who'd ever been targeted by predators who thought age meant weakness. Gerald Hoffman went first, and his closing argument was a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his case. He focused on Marcus's youth, his supposed good intentions, and the complexity of modern financial management. But without credible evidence to support these claims, his argument sounded hollow. Ladies and gentlemen, Hoffman began, Marcus Williams is not the criminal mastermind the prosecution wants you to believe he is. He's a young man who made some poor decisions while trying to help elderly family members navigate complex financial markets. He tried once more to suggest that we were confused about our finances, that market volatility could explain the missing money, and that this was really a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. But after a week of testimony that had clearly demonstrated our competence and the systematic nature of Marcus's crimes, these arguments seemed almost insulting to the jury's intelligence. Amanda Chen's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal advocacy. She systematically dismantled every element of the defense while building an unassailable case for conviction on all counts. Members of the jury, she began, over the past week, you've heard from elderly victims who were targeted not despite their wisdom and experience, but because a predator thought those qualities made them vulnerable. You've heard recorded evidence of the defendant's own voice as he manipulated and threatened people who trusted him. And you've seen financial records that prove beyond any doubt that Marcus Williams systematically stole over $1 million from elderly victims. She walked to the exhibit table and picked up the bank records that had started this entire case. This isn't about complex financial instruments or market volatility. This is about simple theft, made possible by the trust that elderly people placed in someone they thought they could depend on. Amanda then addressed the broader implications of the case. Your verdict in this case will send a message to every potential predator who thinks elderly people are easy targets. It will tell them that age brings wisdom, not weakness, and that elderly victims will fight back when they're victimized. She concluded by looking directly at Marcus. The defendant bet his freedom on the assumption that his elderly victims would be too ashamed, too confused, or too frightened to seek justice. That was the worst bet he ever made, and your verdict should reflect the consequences of that miscalculation. Judge Hendricks gave the jury their instructions at 2 p.m., and they began their deliberations immediately. Catherine had warned me that jury deliberations in complex federal cases could take days, but I had a feeling this one wouldn't take long. The evidence was overwhelming, and the defense had been utterly unconvincing. I was right. At 4:30 p.m., just 2.5 hours after they'd begun deliberating, the jury sent word that they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman, a middle-aged woman who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial, stood to read the verdict. On the count of elder financial abuse, we find the defendant guilty. Marcus's face went pale, but the foreman wasn't finished. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of witness tampering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of operating a Ponzi scheme, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued through all 14 counts, and the verdict was the same each time: guilty. Marcus slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his charm and manipulation had failed him completely. Gerald Hoffman looked like a man who just watched his career prospects evaporate. But in the gallery behind the prosecution table, I could hear quiet sobs of relief from Eleanor, and James was squeezing Margaret's hand. Judge Hendricks thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. As the courtroom began to empty, Amanda turned to me with a smile I'll never forget. "Dorothy, you did it. You stopped him." But I knew it wasn't just me. "We did it," I corrected, "all of us together." Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting. Reporter after reporter asked for my reaction to the verdict, and I gave them the same message I'd been delivering for months. "This verdict sends a clear message," I told the cameras. "Elderly people are not easy targets. We have wisdom, experience, and the determination to fight back when we're victimized. Anyone who thinks age makes us weak is about to learn a very expensive lesson." That evening, Geneva hosted a celebration dinner at her house. Eleanor, James, Margaret, Catherine, Amanda, and Detective Rodriguez all came, along with several other elderly people who'd been inspired by our case to report their own experiences with financial predators. "You know what you've accomplished?" Detective Rodriguez asked as we sat around Geneva's dining room table. "In the 6 months since this case started making news, we've had over 200 elderly people come forward to report financial crimes. You've given an entire population of victims the courage to fight back." Margaret raised her glass. "To Dorothy Williams, who reminded us all that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless." "To all of us," I corrected again, "and to everyone who refuses to be a victim." As I drove home that night, I thought about Marcus sitting in federal detention, probably finally understanding that his assumption about elderly victims had been completely wrong. Tomorrow, I would start the process of recovering my stolen money and helping other victims navigate the legal system. But tonight, I was simply a 72-year-old woman who'd proven that age brings strength, not weakness, and that underestimating Dorothy Williams was a mistake that carried a very high price. Marcus had learned that lesson too late to save himself, but maybe other potential predators would learn it in time to save themselves from making the same catastrophic error in judgment. 6 weeks later, I returned to the federal courthouse for Marcus's sentencing. The proceeding felt different from the trial, more solemn, more final. Judge Hendricks had received dozens of victim impact statements from elderly people across the country who'd been inspired by our case to report their own experiences with financial abuse. I'd written my own victim impact statement, but when Judge Hendricks invited me to address the court before sentencing, I chose to speak from the heart instead. Your Honor, I began, standing at the podium where I'd testified weeks earlier, Marcus Williams didn't just steal my money. He stole my peace of mind, my trust in family, and my sense of security in my retirement years. But more than that, he stole those things from dozens of other elderly people who trusted him to protect their financial futures. I looked directly at Marcus, who sat slumped at the defense table, a very different man from the confident predator who'd tried to gaslight me in his office a year earlier. I want Marcus to understand something, I continued. The elderly people he victimized aren't weak or confused. We're survivors. We've lived through decades of challenges that would test anyone's strength. We built the careers, raised the families, and saved the money that he thought he could simply take from us. I paused, feeling the weight of representing not just myself, but every elderly person who'd ever been targeted by financial predators. I hope that his punishment serves as a warning to anyone else who thinks elderly people are easy targets. We're not, and when you victimize us, we'll fight back with everything we've learned in our decades of experience. Judge Hendricks nodded approvingly, then turned to Marcus. Mr. Williams, do you have anything to say before I impose sentence? Marcus stood shakily, looking older than his 34 years. Your Honor, I want to apologize to my aunt and to all the other victims. I know what I did was wrong, and I understand now how much harm I caused. It was too little, too late, but at least it was an acknowledgement of guilt. Judge Hendricks reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the impact on victims, and the need for deterrence before announcing her decision. Mr. Williams, you systematically targeted elderly victims because you believed they would be too ashamed or confused to report your crimes. You exploited their trust, manipulated their fears, and stole their financial security. This court finds that your actions represent not just theft, but a particularly cruel form of elder abuse that strikes at the heart of our society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I hereby sentence you to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will also pay full restitution to all victims, plus interest and penalties, totaling $1.7 million. 22 years. Marcus would be 56 when he got out of prison, and he'd be paying restitution for the rest of his life. It was a sentence that matched the severity of his crimes and sent exactly the message Judge Hendricks intended. The recovery process had already begun before sentencing. The federal asset forfeiture team had seized Marcus's condo, his Porsche, his investment accounts, and even his expensive suits and watches. Everything would be liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months after sentencing, when I received a check for $162,000, my original $150,000 plus interest and penalties. I'd gotten every penny back, along with compensation for the emotional distress Marcus had caused. Eleanor, James, and Margaret received similar payments, and even victims who hadn't been part of our original group were being compensated as additional assets were recovered. The federal government had proven that crime, at least in this case, definitely didn't pay. With my money restored, I made a decision that surprised even Geneva. I used part of the recovered funds to establish the Dorothy Williams Elder Advocacy Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping elderly victims of financial abuse navigate the legal system and recover their stolen assets. Girl, you're 72 years old, Geneva protested when I told her about the foundation. Most people your age are thinking about relaxing, not starting new careers. Most people my age haven't just spent a year proving that elderly people are forces to be reckoned with, I replied. Besides, someone needs to help victims who don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back on their own. The foundation started small, just me, a part-time assistant, and an office in a building near the courthouse. But within 6 months, we were helping dozens of elderly victims document their cases, find qualified attorneys, and recover stolen assets. The work was remarkably similar to my nursing career, advocating for vulnerable people, navigating complex systems, and refusing to accept no for an answer when someone's welfare was at stake. The only difference was that instead of fighting for patients against hospitals and insurance companies, I was fighting for elderly victims against financial predators and skeptical investigators. Dr. Patricia Michaels, the neuropsychologist who'd evaluated my competency, joined our advisory board. Dorothy, she told me, what you've created here represents a fundamental shift in how we think about aging and advocacy. You're not just helping individual victims, you're changing the narrative about what it means to be elderly in America. She was right. Media coverage of our foundation's work continued to emphasize the same themes that had driven our case against Marcus. Elderly people possess wisdom and strength, not weakness, and anyone who assumes otherwise does so at their own peril. The Foundation's motto, printed on our business cards and website, captured the essence of what we'd learned. Age brings wisdom. Wisdom brings strength. Underestimate us at your own risk. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I received a letter from him in federal prison. He asked for my forgiveness and claimed he'd found religion behind bars. I read it once, then threw it away. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some people need to live with the consequences of their choices. But I did keep one paragraph from his letter, the one where he finally acknowledged what I'd been trying to teach him all along. I understand now that I made a terrible mistake in thinking that elderly people would be easy victims. You and the others taught me that experience and wisdom make people stronger, not weaker. I hope other people learn that lesson without having to pay the price I'm paying. It was the first intelligent thing Marcus had said in years. Too bad he'd learned it too late to save himself from the consequences of underestimating Dorothy Williams and her fellow survivors. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, the call came from the White House. As I sat in my foundation office, reviewing case files, my assistant announced that the president wanted me to keynote a National Elder Abuse Summit. Mrs. Williams, said the crisp voice on the line, your Chicago model has become the gold standard. We want to discuss implementing your approach nationally. 3 weeks later, I stood before federal officials and state attorneys general in Washington, D.C. At 74, I was addressing the highest levels of government about a problem I'd stumbled into by refusing to let my nephew steal from me. 3 years ago, I was just a retired nurse who discovered her nephew had stolen her retirement savings, I began. Today, I'm here because his theft taught me something crucial about the assumptions our society makes about elderly people. I looked out at the serious faces before me. When Marcus Williams decided to steal from me, he assumed I'd be too confused to notice, too ashamed to report it, and too weak to fight back. He was wrong on all counts, and his mistakes cost him 22 years of freedom. The response was immediate. 12 state attorneys general approached me about implementing our model. The Department of Justice announced funding for 20 elder advocacy centers nationwide. But the most meaningful conversation came with Maria Santos from the National Institute on Aging. Mrs. Williams, you've changed how we think about aging itself. Instead of focusing on decline, you've shown us the power of accumulated wisdom. 6 months later, the Department of Health and Human Services called with an offer. Oversee the national rollout of advocacy centers in 20 cities. At 74, most people would have declined such demanding work. But I'd learned something important. I was energized by fighting for justice. I've spent 3 years proving age is an asset, not a liability, I told them. If you're ready to put that principle to work nationally, so am I. The next phase began immediately. Traveling from Seattle to Miami, each new center proved that elderly people, when properly organized, were formidable advocates. In Houston, we helped elderly immigrants recover $500,000 from a predator targeting people with limited English. In Phoenix, 12 retirement communities created an early warning system that stopped scams before they could claim victims. But Detroit was our biggest success. Eleanor Patterson, now our lead peer counselor, helped establish a center that became the national model. Every day, I meet elderly people who've been told they're helpless, Eleanor told me as we reviewed their first-year numbers. Every day, I get to show them they're wrong. Detroit processed 200 cases in year one, recovering $3.2 million and training 500 elderly volunteers as advocates. The program's success attracted international attention. Canada, the UK, and Australia invited me to speak about strategies for protecting aging populations from sophisticated predators. Word was spreading through criminal networks. Elderly victims in certain cities fought back effectively. Predators were learning Marcus's lesson too late. Underestimating elderly people carried serious consequences. As I prepared for my next trip to Portland and Salt Lake City, I thought about Marcus asking to help with my finances, assuming I'd be too old and confused to notice his theft. He'd been wrong about everything. His mistakes had taught me the power that comes with age, experience, and refusing to accept others' assumptions about elderly capabilities. By my 80th birthday, the movement had grown beyond my wildest dreams. 20 federally funded centers had processed 5,000 cases, recovering $200 million and securing convictions against 700 predators. But the real impact was cultural. Society was finally seeing elderly people as powerful advocates, not inevitable victims. The World Health Organization asked me to chair an international commission developing global elder advocacy standards. Working with 50 experts from 6 continents in Geneva, I was struck by how universal the problems had become. Predators in every country use the same psychological manipulation, reported Dr. Elena Petrov from Russia. They claim elderly victims are confused, too old to understand modern systems, and too ashamed to seek help. Dr. James Okafor from Nigeria nodded. In Lagos, elderly victims receiving advocacy support were just as effective as those in developed countries. The universal factor is empowerment, not resources. The Commission developed international standards for elder advocacy, adopted by the UN General Assembly, with representatives from 192 countries. The elderly population represents humanity's greatest repository of wisdom, I told the Assembly. When we empower elderly people to protect their communities, we tap into this extraordinary resource. When we treat them as victims, we waste it. This led to funding for programs in Bangladesh, Kenya, Guatemala, and 12 other countries where elderly people previously had no recourse against predators. The most meaningful development was our international fellowship program, bringing young advocates worldwide to Chicago for intensive training. What you've created gives us hope for protecting elderly people in India, said Priya Sharma, our first Mumbai fellow. The principles translate perfectly. Age brings wisdom, not weakness. Major philanthropic organizations took notice. The Gates Foundation funded expansion in sub-Saharan Africa, while the Ford Foundation supported Latin American programs. But the recognition that meant most came from the American Nurses Association, creating the Dorothy Williams Award for Advocacy Excellence. Dorothy Williams has shown nursing advocacy doesn't end with retirement, said ANA President Patricia Johnson. She's applied patient advocacy skills to protecting vulnerable elderly people. Her work represents nursing's highest ideals. At the Chicago ceremony, Eleanor Patterson, now 88 and still active in peer counseling, introduced me perfectly. 8 years ago, Dorothy discovered her nephew had stolen her savings. Today, because she refused to accept that theft quietly, millions of elderly people worldwide are safer. She turned being a victim into becoming a protector. Accepting the award, I thought about Marcus in his 11th prison year, finally understanding how completely his assumptions had backfired. When Marcus Williams stole from me, he bet that elderly people were too confused, ashamed, and weak to fight back. That bet cost him his freedom and accidentally launched a movement protecting millions worldwide. Looking at the audience of nurses, elderly volunteers, and young attorneys carrying our work forward, I continued. The lesson Marcus learned too late applies to every potential predator. Underestimating elderly people is the most dangerous mistake you can make. We have decades of experience, unlimited patience, and nothing left to lose. When you target us, you're not picking on vulnerable victims. You're awakening sleeping giants. Marcus's crime had backfired spectacularly, creating the opposite of his intentions. Instead of one vulnerable victim, he'd awakened an international network, making the world safer for elderly people everywhere. On my 81st birthday, Catherine Morrison brought me an unexpected visitor, Rebecca Williams, Marcus's daughter. At 26, the recent law school graduate had her father's features, but with determination instead of manipulation. Mrs. Williams, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite obvious nervousness. I've been following your work, and I'd like to join your organization. I studied her carefully, using assessment skills from decades of evaluating patients and potential threats. Why? I asked simply. Because my father's crimes destroyed our family, but they also created something important. You turned his theft into a movement protecting thousands of elderly people. I want to be part of that protection, not the destruction. Rebecca had specialized in elder law specifically because of Marcus's crimes, graduating magna cum laude from Northwestern, where she'd taken the advocacy course I'd helped develop. Your father assumed I'd be too old and weak to fight back, I told her. If you're willing to learn from elderly people rather than assuming you know what's best for them, you can help us prove that assumption wrong. Rebecca joined our legal team and quickly proved herself exceptional with elderly clients. She had her father's charm, but channeled it toward empowerment rather than exploitation. She's remarkable, Eleanor told me after working with Rebecca on a complex church embezzlement case. She has her father's ability to connect with people, but she uses it to help them become stronger. Rebecca's arrival coincided with establishing our national training university in Chicago. The Dorothy Williams Institute would offer certificate programs, ensuring our methods were taught consistently across the growing network. You've created a new profession, elder advocacy specialist, that didn't exist before your nephew's mistake, said Senator Patricia Chen, who championed federal funding. The Institute's first class included 50 students from 23 states. The most popular course was Understanding the Elderly Mind as an Asset, which I taught personally. Elderly people aren't just witnesses to crimes against them, I told each class. They're experts on how those crimes operate. A 70-year-old fraud victim knows more about predator methods than any textbook. Rebecca became my most effective teaching assistant, bringing unique perspective as a convicted elder abuser's daughter. Her presence sent a powerful message. Children of predators could choose solutions over problems. My father thought elderly people were easy targets, she told students. He was wrong, and his mistake created this entire movement. Every successful case proves his assumptions wrong again. The Institute also became a research center. Dr. Sarah Chen's studies showed elderly advocates had better health outcomes and higher life satisfaction than peers. Fighting for justice was literally life extending. Within 3 years, we were training financial institutions, healthcare systems, and law enforcement agencies. Each program reinforced our central message. Elderly people are powerful advocates when properly supported. Rebecca had emerged as the obvious choice to lead the organization's future. Her appointment as executive director would demonstrate that positive change could emerge from even the worst situations. "I'll never distance this organization from what my father did," she said when I offered the position. "His crimes are part of our story, and acknowledging that keeps us focused on why this work matters." Her acceptance speech was powerful. My father bet his freedom on the assumption that elderly people were weak and afraid. That bet backfired so completely that it created a movement now protecting millions worldwide. Every day I work to prove his assumptions wrong, honors the victims he hurt, and the advocates who've shown me a better way. Under Rebecca's leadership, the Institute expanded internationally while maintaining our personal approach. Every elderly person was treated as a potential advocate, not just a victim. Marcus's theft had been intended to exploit one elderly woman's supposed vulnerability. Instead, it had sparked a global movement with his own daughter, now leading the fight against everything he'd represented. Sometimes the biggest mistakes create the most important legacies, just not for the people who make them. 20 years after discovering Marcus's theft, I sat in my study at 92, surrounded by letters from elderly people worldwide whose lives had been changed by the movement his crime had accidentally inspired. The most recent came from Dr. Priya Sharma in India. "Mrs. Williams, last month we helped a 90-year-old grandmother recover money stolen by her grandson and establish our region's first elder advocacy center. She said, 'If an American grandmother could fight back and win, so can I.' Your story has become legend here." Similar letters arrived weekly from every continent. Elderly people finding courage to fight back because they'd heard about a retired nurse in Chicago who'd refused to let her nephew's theft go unpunished. Rebecca Williams, now 41, and internationally recognized as the leader of elder advocacy, had just published The Dorothy Williams Method, the definitive textbook for our accidentally created profession. The numbers told an incredible story. The Dorothy Williams Institute now operated in 127 countries, had trained over 250,000 elderly advocates, and had helped recover $50 billion in stolen assets. But statistics couldn't capture the cultural transformation. Elderly people elevated from presumed victims to recognized advocates. This transformation was evident in legislation establishing elder advocate as a protected profession, medical schools teaching aging as asset accumulation, and criminal justice systems treating elderly complainants as valuable partners. Eleanor Patterson, now 98 and still volunteering, had become a Harvard Business School case study on leadership in later life. James Chen had returned to Taiwan as a national hero for elderly rights. Margaret Walsh had passed away at 101, featured in documentaries about successful aging shown in medical schools worldwide. The movement had influenced popular culture. Movies, shows, and books increasingly portrayed elderly characters as powerful advocates. The phrase, don't pull a Marcus Williams, meaning don't underestimate elderly people, had entered common usage. Marcus remained in federal prison, where he'd become a cautionary tale among inmates. His counselor reported he spent time reading news coverage, finally understanding his miscalculations' scope. He tells other inmates that targeting elderly people is the stupidest crime possible because elderly victims are the most dangerous adversaries in the criminal justice system. He's become an unintentional advocate for elder rights. As I reflected on 2 decades of unintended consequences, I realized Marcus's crime had taught me something profound about aging, wisdom, and human potential. His theft had forced me to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed and build something outlasting both my life and his sentence. The Foundation's mission statement, written 20 years earlier in anger and determination, had proven prophetic. Age brings wisdom. Wisdom brings strength. Underestimate us at your own risk. These words now appeared on advocacy centers in dozens of languages, courthouse walls in multiple countries, and law enforcement training materials worldwide. They'd become more than a motto, a fundamental principle of how modern societies protected elderly citizens. The most powerful moment in my final years came when I received a letter from Marcus himself, 20 years into his sentence. For the first time since his conviction, I decided to read it. Aunt Dot, it began, I know I have no right to contact you, but I've been following your work from prison. I understand now that I didn't just steal your money. I accidentally created something far more powerful than what I tried to destroy. Every day, I read about elderly people fighting back because you showed them how. My crime backfired so completely that it's become a force for protecting the very people I thought I could exploit. He was right. His theft had been intended to take advantage of one elderly woman's supposed weakness. Instead, it had awakened a global movement that had fundamentally changed how society viewed and protected elderly people. Looking back on 20 years of unintended consequences, I realized that Marcus's biggest mistake wasn't just stealing from me, it was underestimating what one determined elderly woman could accomplish when pushed too far. As I finished writing my memoirs on that autumn morning, I thought about every elderly person who would read this story and recognize their own strength. Every family member who would learn to see aging as an accumulation of assets rather than losses, and every potential predator who would think twice before targeting someone they assumed was too old to fight back. Marcus Williams thought he was stealing from a helpless old woman. Instead, he created a legacy that would protect elderly people forever. He bet his freedom on the assumption that Dorothy Williams was too old, too confused, and too weak to fight back. It was the worst bet in criminal history, and its consequences will echo through generations of elderly people who refuse to be victims because one retired nurse in Chicago showed them that age brings strength, not weakness. The best revenge, it turned out, was building something better from the ashes of what someone tried to destroy, and making sure the whole world knew that underestimating elderly people is the most dangerous mistake anyone can make.